it is fascinating to watch the evolution of the debate about whether we should waive patents on the vaccines and their technology in which to develop. And we have gone from the initial things like it's not necessary to, well, it won't get relief quick enough, as if like you can't do two things simultaneously, like give vaccines and start to build the capacity to create vaccines 6 months down the road, 3 months down the road, 9 months down the road, whatever you choose. We also heard like it's impossible for these countries to develop a process of making sure that the vaccines are of a good quality.
As the Baltimore plant contaminated 15 million doses and also essentially slowed production in other countries who are using, AstraZeneca is very similar to the J&J one. They are having to do additional quality control because of the pristine United States facilities.
Right. I mean, the idea being that you can't have problems in the United States and you can't have success in other countries is just absurd. It's bizarre. It's completely unrelated to the question of IP. Like, you just simply create a mechanism to make that happen. And then, of course, the double-edged sword of, Pfizer telling its shareholders, hey, we're going to be doing booster shots probably. And then, well, all of a sudden, if you got a facility that's going to take 9 months to get online, well, that's going to fit in quite nicely with the need for booster shots.
And a reminder that they got to this point after millions of dollars in investment from the German government. And the other vaccines were invested in by the United States government.
Billions.
And now they've made billions and billions, like I think $23 billion, but that's not enough for the shareholders with not really much of their own investment at all.
Well, we haven't gotten to that argument yet, right? I mean, because all of the arguments that we've heard them deploy have been about it's impractical, it's not going to help, it's unnecessary. None of it has been about what it's really been about, which Emma has just alluded to, which is we don't want to cut into our profits. Yeah. And remember, all of these vaccines, in one form or another, have received billions of dollars, whether it's in the Pfizer BioNTech, where 500 million came from the German government, but there was $1.5 billion promised up front, a pre-order from the U.S. government, whether the vaccine worked or not. I mean, that's a pretty nice sort of insurance policy there to go ahead and develop these. And the development of mRNA technology and all of these technologies have been a function of enormous government investment. But that's not even really the point, right? I mean, the point isn't whether the U.S. government and other governments have already invested in this stuff and should own part of it, although that's a separate argument, which I would also make. But now, at least, now that the Biden administration has been forced into announcing a commitment to waive the patents, and we'll see what the implications of that are. But now that they've been doing that, now we're seeing the sort of knock on a little bit more honest conversation about why folks were against the waiving of the patents. And here it is. I present to you Bloomberg News.
We have to be really careful with the language we use around this conversation. One thing the left has done has monopolized the moral high ground with a single perspective. And what it does, it does not allow people to ask legitimate questions. And I think the starting position is not that the Democrats want to help low and middle income countries and the conservatives, the Republicans do not. I don't see that. It's about how you help those countries. And that's the debate we need to have on a program like this. And when I hear you say things like Senator Warren would like the waiver.
Pause it for 1 second. So it's set up as if there is bullying from the left morally, because they're taking some type of moral high ground. But we really should be talking about how to do this. And in other words, there is no moral response to the idea that we should share vaccine technology with other countries. It's really just a question of like, well, how can we help these countries the best? But there is no one making the argument that we should stop at allowing these IP waivers. No one's making the argument we should allow the IP waivers and not give vaccines to these countries. No, in fact, we have already made a commitment to send 60 million doses to India. We should be sending as many doses as we can around the world. No one has any compunction with that. So it's not really a question of how. It's like, why would we constrain ourselves? Why wouldn't we throw the kitchen sink at this? But it is amazing how much they talk about this and never actually articulate what they say they can't say.
And that's such a key point, because they're not even saying that argument anymore.
That's what I'm saying.
Because they know, right, because they know it's so flimsy that, yeah, we can do both. We can give them vaccine doses now, and we can waive the IP so that there's mass production down the line.
Continue.
Senator Warren would like the waiver for IP. I think the worry that people have is that Senator Warren doesn't want it to stop there. She wants it to go further. Isn't that the real debate down in DC at the moment? That the freedoms people have lost, the freedom of movement, the freedom of speech, arguably, which is an argument going on down in DC at the moment. And if then we get into property rights, does it stop there, just in the crisis, or does it go further? Isn't that the ultimate concern right now?
That is not necessarily the immediate concern, but the ultimate concern. I think you could make potentially a pretty persuasive slippery slope argument about how far this goes and what the effect would be potentially on vaccine production for who knows if this is even going to be the last pandemic that I lived through. We don't know when the next time we're going to have such a worldwide effort to ramp up production of vaccines. So the long-term concerns are there. And when I say the moral arguments that have won the Biden administration over, to be clear, these are moral arguments, but they're not the only moral arguments involved in this. So that has been so far the winning moral argument in terms of winning over the Biden administration, which is in control of this. But it does raise a lot of questions going forward for the long term. But really, a lot of the conversation in Washington is more on the immediate threats. Even though there are concerns that mostly are being expressed on the right, a lot of, especially when you hear the Biden administration, a lot of the rhetoric around this is how to produce this vaccine right now as quickly as possible.
Yep.
They're complaining that's the only moral argument that's being presented.
And they're not presenting any alternate moral arguments because there isn't one.
Exactly.
But the long term, and let's be clear on what they mean by the long term and the slippery slope here. They are concerned, and they're not telling all of their concerns. The ones that they're expressing are, we don't know how this is going to impact vaccine production in the future. In other words, what's going to happen when we have all of this capacity to produce vaccines and we no longer can deploy the argument, they don't have the capacity to produce vaccines, why would we give them the IP? And not only just in general for vaccines for gosh knows what's going on, but we're not going to have the leverage to say this if there's another pandemic. I mean, literally their argument is, if we build vaccine creation production capacity, the pressure to give these other countries that cannot afford to develop, because look, there's just not other countries, or there's not as many other countries that can give 5 different companies $1 billion to go produce a vaccine and roll the dice.
And when they say a slippery slope argument, what they mean is it's a slippery slope towards that exact
That's what they're
thing
saying.
that you're saying, that there will be an understanding worldwide that vaccine production can be done quickly. And so he says this may not be the only pandemic that I lived through. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. The fact that we should set up infrastructure for the next pandemic as climate change causes more encroachment into the wilderness, and as animals continue to pass these diseases onto humans, there will be another one down the line. So the slippery slope argument is purely about pharmaceutical profits. Think about how myopic and how sick in the head you have to be to think that that is the biggest issue here. No. This is a trend in the correct direction as more pandemics come around.
Well, and I will go further and say, forget pandemics. I hope the slope is incredibly slippery. In fact, I hope it's, an elevator heading right down to the bottom of the slope because there is no reason why for a whole host of vaccinations and frankly, other drugs that we should not be, we should not be investing billions of dollars into the development of these things and not use them for where they're needed around the world. We should no longer be sinking money into the development of drugs and of technologies and whatnot, and allowing them to be gatekept by private entities that get these this money. I'm sorry. It's just we should not be doing. So Bloomberg. I hope the slope is super, super slippery.
Bloomberg will do you one better. Remove IP for all medicine.
There you go. All right.
Can I just say one thing on the TRIPS agreement? That was in the 90s. So this regime we have of IP, just insane IP protections is recent, and we can go back to prior to.
Yeah, of course. And, but here we're at. And at least they were honest enough to almost sort of lay it out very clearly.